So in this video we are going to be looking at fundamentally how do we recover the light. Okay, so recovering the light in an image from a raw file is really understanding the histogram and the relationship of the histogram to the primary sliders that we have below. And by making reference to that and understanding the relationship between all the sliders and how they work together means that we can start to pull out the light that has been flattened effectively within this image. Okay, so let's start. Before we do that, I would like to just take you over the histogram here. Okay, and this histogram, as I move my cursor from left to right, you'll see that there's a description underneath that changes. And the very right, we have this band here, and that's the whites. That's the white part of the histogram. Adjacent to that is are the highlights. In the middle we have what's called exposure, although I think that's a bit of a misnomer because we would apply exposure to the whole picture. So I would rather call that midtones. Then we have shadows, and then we have blacks. Now for each of those bands we have a slider. So we have an exposure slider, a highlight slider, a shadow slider, whites and blacks. And if we move any of these, it will affect that part of the histogram. So as I grab the highlight slider, it's moving the highlights part of the histogram. Now it's not moving just the highlights band, okay, because obviously the highlights band is connected to the whites to the right of it. So as I push the highlights to the right, they are starting to be pushed into the whites, and therefore the whites are affected. As I push the highlights to the right, they're pulling from the left, and therefore some of these tones in the midtones, or what's called exposure, are being affected as well. So when we look at these sliders, we've got to consider this is the main area of effect that I'm having, but it isn't just the highlights that's being affected. The adjacent bands are being affected. So if I push the blacks to the right, then if you look at this again, let's just go back. If we push that to the right, then obviously shadows are being affected, but we also saw the midtones, aka exposure, being affected. So we're just going to be mindful of that. Right, so when we look at a picture, we've got to look at the histogram, and we've got to say, okay, what are the main things we want to do? Well, fundamentally, the whites are off. Okay, so that means to say the whites are not set. My white point, my brightest point in the picture has not been set because it's been slightly underexposed. So I've got two things to do here. I could either increase the whites like that, which is grabbing the whole histogram effectively, you see that, or I could move exposure to the right. So it's sort of a push or a pull effect. Now I'm going to pull the whites across. Now if I hit the Option or the Alt key, you see the screen goes black, and then as they start to clip, they're highlighted on the screen there. So I go as far as clipping and then bring it back. If I wanted to set the blacks as well, then I could move these to the left, and equally I could hit the Option key, the screen goes white, and when they start to clip, you see that become apparent on this diagram here. Okay, so for this particular image I'm not going to set the blacks. That isn't mandatory. Setting the whites is fairly mandatory for most images, but I can see the snow in these hills are starting to lose a little bit of definition, so I'm just going to bring this back for now. We don't need to set the whites the first time through. Okay, now let's increase the exposure. I'm going to bring back the highlights because quite possibly these areas here are in the highlights as well. So I'm going to bring the highlights down, okay, and I might even bring the exposure down, and then I'm going to stretch the whites across, okay, and I might just bring the exposure down and push the whites across. Now if we look at these little controls down here, I click on this one, I can toggle between what I've done, the previous state, and what I've done. And you'll notice a fundamental difference. It's not just a fundamental difference in terms of the histogram and the sliders that I've changed, but also the color has changed, and you have to be very mindful of this. When you move these sliders, you will impact color, and we can see that this has gone very much to the blue. So what I'm going to do is go on to hue, saturation, luminance adjustments, and I'm going to increase the luminance of the blue channel. Now, first of all, if we go back here, we can see I pulled down exposure and highlights. If we reduce the brightness of something, we increase the saturation. If we increase the brightness of something, we reduce the saturation. So to compensate for the reduction in brightness over here, I'm going to the color channels and I'm going to increase the brightness of the blues. Okay. And how do I know how far to do that? Well, simply I'll click before and after. Okay, so that's really telling me where I was. So let's go back. See those greys? Let's keep an eye on these greys here. They're kind of, yeah, they're still quite blue. So let's just push these aside. So don't get distracted by luminosity, but the color. And the color's pretty much the same. Okay, so we can go back to the main slider. Now look at this histogram. It's very much to the right, so I'm just going to pull back the exposure even more because this cloud in the sky was very much a dominant feature. I'm going to push the whites to the right, so I'm going to hit the Option key or Alt key and just push my whites until they start clipping and then bring them back. Okay, I've gone very blue again, so I'm going to go to hue, saturation and increase the luminance of the blues, and I might actually now start to reduce the saturation of the blues. Okay, so we can go from before and after. Still quite blue, so let's bring that blue just a little bit further back, and I'm going to go back to exposure, bring that down even more. Okay, go back to hue, saturation, bring down the saturation now, back to the main slider. So this is looking pretty good. What I need to do now is to look at this rock, which has become very dark. So it's in the shadows, so I'm just going to lift the shadows. In this particular image, it's not really affecting the sky because that's really in the midtones, so that's in this part of the histogram. So this rock is down here, it's in the shadows and the blacks, so I can afford to move the shadow slider to the right. And there we have before, a fairly flat and insipid image, and there we have after. Now obviously this is only the start of the photographic journey and there's more to be done, but we've achieved the main things that we wanted to do, and that was to balance the light in the image in the way that it was seen in the field. So the sky was dark, the snow on the far mountains was reasonably bright, the sun was shining on this particular rock here, and the sea was quite a sort of vibrant green. Now there's more green to be brought out of that, but at this stage, at this first level, this is what we've done, and I'm quite satisfied with that. So the relationship of these sliders corresponds very much to the histogram at the top. We've had to also look at saturation and luminance when using those sliders, particularly when there's a lot of blue in an image. That tends to shift quite a lot. Okay, and we have adjusted these sliders in concert. So we've not just whacked a slider to the left and to the right and see how it looks. We've done it progressively. So think of these as 5 guitar strings, and we use those in concert and we ease them backwards and forwards as appropriate. Okay, easing back, very slowly adjusting. Whenever we adjust one slider, it affects other areas because they're all linked, and therefore as you move one slider to the left or to the right, then you've got to have an effect on the other domains. Okay, and there we have it. Thank you.